So my favorite YouTuber JJ McCullough has made videos about both France and the Philippines exploring the concept of Regnal Chronology, or the idea that you can get a broad understanding of the history of a country by looking only at its leaders. I found the France video especially insightful because of the constant regime changes that the country experienced from the late 18th to the mid 20th centuries. And his video got me thinking, what's another country that has a dynamic and chaotic history the way France does that would also be valuable to explore the Regnal Chronology of? You already know based on the title of this video that the country I'm talking about is Germany. Before I start, I want to encourage you to check out JJ's video on France because it largely inspired this one and I think it's excellent. Also, for the monarchy section of this video, I'm going to be referring to this German monarchs chart created by user The Real Scorpion on Reddit, which is easily one of the most detailed and helpful historical charts I've ever come across, so go show that post some love too. Without further ado, let's get started with taking a look at everyone who has ruled the land we call Germany. So when I say we're talking about every ruler of Germany in this video, that already raises some questions because Germany as a unified entity didn't exist until 1871. And if you want to get even more technical, the modern political system and borders didn't exist all the way until 1990, when the communist East Germany collapsed and rejoined the capitalist West Germany. But this video would be boring if I only covered like 5 chancellors of the post-1990 reunified Germany, so the starting point for this video is going to be the year 800. Before the year 800, there was really no central authority in the region, even though humans had been living in what is now modern-day Germany for at least 10,000 years. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of individual tribes occupying the area with some shared language and culture, but there was no clear supreme authority, which would make it hard to arbitrarily assign a leader. If you've ever seen the movie Gladiator before, you might remember that the opening of the film features the Roman Empire fighting the Germanic tribes to the north, which they called the Barbarians. The Romans were famously never able to conquer the region though, so we can't consider any Roman emperors to be the rulers of Germany in that sense, even though they did oversee some military victories. So fast forwarding to the year 800 that I mentioned earlier, the first central authority to include modern-day Germany in its borders was the Carolingian Empire. If that name doesn't sound familiar to you, you might have heard of King Charlemagne, nicknamed the Father of Europe because of his conquest of most of the western half of the continent, and being the common ancestor for pretty much all of the major European monarchies that would exist for the next 1,000 years. Charlemagne was not a German though. You might have been able to tell by the way his name sounds, he was actually French. And something I want to clarify here early on is that throughout most of German history, the feudalism system was used, meaning that Charlemagne himself did not exert a ton of direct control over the region. He was instead the central authority to a bunch of nobility titles who had lower nobility reporting to them, and lower nobility reporting to them, and so on and so on. I mean, just look at this map of the Holy Roman Empire and tell me it doesn't confuse the hell out of you. Wait a second, I haven't even explained what the Holy Roman Empire is yet. There's a famous quote from Voltaire saying that the Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, and this is kind of true. For much of its history, there was some intertwinement with the Pope's authority, but it certainly wasn't Roman, it was in Germany, not in Italy, and it was probably decentralized enough to not really be considered an empire in the traditional sense. The more I researched the HRE, which I'm going to refer to it as for the rest of this video, the more complicated and hard to explain it gets, because I don't even think the people living in the HRE even knew exactly what it was. For a super oversimplified explanation, the HRE was a feudal system made up of individual states with various nobility titles reporting to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the central authority crowned by the Pope. In the Middle Ages especially, the Pope held a ton of political power, and it was debated often whether he or the Holy Roman Emperor was actually the more powerful of the two. In reality, they gave each other sort of a mutual legitimacy that's hard to define in straightforward political terms, because there was no clear set of powers that either had, with them often shifting between one and the other. When Charlemagne conquered modern-day Germany, he was crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day 800. The region was simply referred to as the Roman Empire at the time, and Charlemagne held the title of Roman Emperor among many others from his various territorial holdings. Charlemagne had 3 sons and originally planned to split his Carolingian Empire into 3 upon his death, which would have made the HRE a truly separate domain even earlier on. But 2 of his sons died before he did, so the entire thing was given to his son Louis. Like with any great empire, there was a succession crisis that led to civil wars between Louis's children after he died. But this time there was an extra layer of complexity because his son Lothar was also the Pope. The Carolingian Empire was split into 3, with Louis's son Charles II getting West Francia, his son Lothair getting Middle Francia, and his son Louis II getting Germany. Louis II was not crowned Holy Roman Emperor though. because his brother was the Pope and he kept the emperor title for himself. So, from the year 843 to 962, we get a weird string of kings who ruled the Holy Roman Empire, but were not the Holy Roman Emperor. What used to be Charlemagne's empire was engulfed in a period of chaos for those 100 years. And honestly, while researching this video, I got a little confused myself on what exactly was the deal with the political situation at the time. But in essence, the Carolingian dynasty that started with Charlemagne continued to rule Germany until 887, when Charles III, the great-grandson of Charlemagne, was deposed. The Pope then crowned Guy II, who was not a part of the Carolingian dynasty, but instead an aristocrat from the Spoleto region in northern Italy. During this time, there was yet another chaotic succession back and forth, where Guy II's son Lambert became emperor after his death, and then the crown went back to a Carolingian with Charles III's nephew Arnulf laying claim to the title. The title then went to a distant relative of Arnulf, Louis III, who was a great-great-great-grandson of Charlemagne. But of course, this is the Holy Roman Empire, so we can't stop there, because he was deposed by his distant relative Berengar in 905. If you've been counting, we're at 5 different ruling dynasties now in just 17 years. Don't worry though, things from this point on get a little less complicated. After Berengar died, there wasn't a clear direction on where to go next because of the absolute mess that was the last few decades of succession. An heir of Charlemagne, Otto I was the Duke of Saxony, a major region in the HRE that was also one of its most powerful nobility titles for much of history. Otto was elected German king by the nobility because of his vision for a unified region following the chaos of years past, and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 962 after falling into favor with the Pope from defending Italy from invaders. The HRE was officially back, and Otto's descendants would define its leadership for hundreds of years to come. There were 3 direct descendants in Otto's line that would become Holy Roman Emperor: Otto II, Otto III, and Henry II, who died childless. Conrad II, a descendant of Otto I, was elected as the new king in 1024 and became Holy Roman Emperor in 1027. His line would continue for over 100 years until the death of his descendant Henry V. During this time period, ruled by what was called the Salian dynasty, the emperor held a clear authority over the Pope and was actually considered the head of the Roman Catholic Church. This was probably the period of history where the HRE held the most power as explicitly its own entity and not a subordinate of a larger power like it was during the time of Charlemagne. There was a clear German national identity beginning to form at this point that was a breakaway from their previous French rulers, although like I mentioned earlier, the empire, if you can even call it that, was extremely decentralized and was more like a group of hundreds of mini-countries vaguely reporting to the emperor in one capacity or another. Following Henry V's death in 1125, the title of Holy Roman Emperor was given to Lothar II, who was installed as an emperor more subservient to the Pope following a series of conflicts between the prior emperors and popes about who had the proper authority to appoint bishops and abbots in the various German states. Lothar II died without any sons, so the title bounced around a few different dynasties in the years following, starting with the Staufen dynasty from 1155 to 1197, then to the Welf dynasty until 1215, then to the Staufen dynasty again until 1250, until Emperor Frederick II fell out of favor with the Pope and was excommunicated from the church altogether, causing a 23-year interregnum with no clear claimant to the throne or anyone being crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. At this time, the Habsburg family began to emerge to prominence in Austria, a family famous for gaining immense political power throughout most of Europe through inbreeding and selective marriages. There's a famous quote about the Habsburgs stating, "Let others wage war, let you, happy Austrian, marry," which explains their strategy of conquest, marriage instead of bloodshed. By 1273, the Habsburgs were ready to make their first big move when Rudolf I was elected German king. He was not, however, crowned Holy Roman Emperor, nor were his successors Adolf and Albert. During this time, France was increasing in power and political influence, which was the domino that began the very slow decline and eventual collapse of the HRE. After King Albert's rule ended, the Habsburg line ruling Germany came to a close, for now. Don't forget about them just yet. A descendant of Charles II, Henry VII, was elected onto the throne and bent the knee to the Pope by conceding pieces of Italian territory and pledging to no longer attempt to expand the borders of the HRE. As a result, Henry VII was the first man to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor since Frederick II nearly 60 years prior. After Henry's death, his son was considered too young to rule, so another descendant of Charles II, Louis IV, was elected. Keep in mind that while these emperors weren't Habsburgs directly, the Habsburgs were still a major influence at the time and had close relations with the Holy Roman Emperors. Henry VII married his daughter to a Habsburg to secure a political alliance, and Louis IV was the cousin of a Habsburg, Frederick, who was very nearly Holy Roman Emperor himself. The succession reverted to Henry VII's line after Louis IV's death, which continued until 1437 when the Habsburgs came back into power. From 1452 all the way until the end of the HRE in 1806, there would be a string of 17 emperors that were all Habsburgs. The family had officially cemented themselves into a significant position of power with potential for expansion through, of course, marriage. Like I said earlier, the HRE's decline was gradual and happened over the course of about 500 or 600 years. During the reign of Charles V from 1519 to 1556, the Protestant Reformation occurred, which split the HRE into two different religious factions, so you could argue this was the point where the Holy Moniker truly became inaccurate, especially because of the decreasing power of the Pope and therefore the Holy Roman Emperor by proxy. After 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor was no longer crowned by the Pope at all, and the infighting and decreased centralized power only became more prominent from that point onwards. Remember when I said France was growing in power to the east, and that was a major factor in the decline of the empire? Well, this all came to a climax during the age of Napoleon in the early 19th century. During his conquest of Europe, Napoleon sought to restore the HRE to French control as it once was 1,000 years prior, and viewed the sitting Habsburg Emperor Francis II as weak and powerless. Well, Napoleon was correct, and he easily took modern-day Germany during the Napoleonic Wars. Francis II decided he would rather end the HRE entirely than give the title to a Frenchman, which is exactly what he did. The Holy Roman Empire officially ended in the year 1806, after 1,006 years, one of the longest surviving political entities in history. The writing on the wall was there, and the empire was bound to collapse sooner rather than later. It was a bygone relic of an age that had long passed, and as the world was rapidly changing around it, it refused to change itself until it was much too late. Napoleon was therefore the leader of modern-day Germany from 1806 to 1813, with his official title being Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine. After Napoleon's defeat in the Congress of Vienna that established the new European borders following over a decade of the most brutal warfare that the continent had ever seen up to that point, the German Federation was established, which was the replacement to the HRE. It was a collection of German-speaking states with no central authority that was instead ruled over by the Austrian monarch, so rule of Germany actually went back to the Habsburgs, and more specifically, Francis II once again. Well, Francis II was technically Francis I now, because he was Emperor of Austria instead of Holy Roman Emperor, a position that had been held in tandem prior. This continued for two more Austrian emperors, Ferdinand I and Franz Joseph I, until Prussia defeated Austria in the 7 Weeks' War in 1866 and took the territory for themselves, reforming into the North German Confederation. For a little over 3 years, the Prussian king, Wilhelm I, held this title, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, which essentially meant he was in charge of the North German Confederation. But the reason you've probably never heard of the North German Confederation before is because it didn't last very long at all. Under the leadership of Wilhelm and primarily the Prussian Prime Minister and later German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the North German Confederation won a series of conflicts against Denmark, the Habsburgs, and France that resulted in the Confederation and pieces of surrounding territory uniting as the German Empire in 1871. Wilhelm became German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm I, with Kaiser being a translation of Caesar, fully tying the empire to its past with the HRE, another entity that really had nothing to do with Rome but loved cosplaying as it. Upon Wilhelm's death in 1888, power passed to his son Frederick III. Remember, the reason that he's the third is because he was also the king of Prussia, but Frederick died from cancer after just 99 days in power, so the title of German Emperor passed down to his son, Wilhelm II. If you know your history, you would know that Kaiser Wilhelm II was in power during the War to End All Wars, World War I. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, a close ally of the German Empire, was assassinated in Bosnia on June 28, 1914, which led Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia and the German Empire to join in, partially because of their existing alliance to Austria-Hungary, and partially because of their desire to establish themselves as a dominant global power. We all know that World War I, of course, ended in German defeat, and the Great War caused radical shifts in the political structures of European countries, especially among the losers. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated as emperor, and the Treaty of Versailles punished Germany severely, and led to the creation of the weak and unstable Weimar Republic to replace what had been the German Empire prior to 1919. The new country was a constitutional republic with presidential elections through a parliamentary democracy. There were two presidents, the first being Friedrich Ebert, who was briefly followed by two acting presidents after his death in office in 1925. President Paul von Hindenburg was the next elected president of the republic, and served from 1925 until his death in office in 1934. And then came along the most infamous German leader of all, and probably world leader of all time. YouTube is annoying, so in this video I'm going to have to call him the Austrian Painter, but you all know exactly who I'm talking about. The Austrian Painter was appointed Chancellor by President Paul von Hindenburg in 1933, and then succeeded him as president after his political party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, gained a plurality in parliament. That political party has a more well-known name, but again, for the purposes of this video, I have to use the longer name because of YouTube censorship. The Austrian Painter exploited the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic to form the Third Reich, and during his time in the leadership position, he declared himself Führer, which translates to leader and in practice was essentially a dictator role. As we all know, the Austrian Painter committed some of the worst atrocities in human history during his time as Führer from 1934 to 1945, which culminated in the outbreak of World War II after his invasions of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. In 1941, Germany essentially controlled all of Europe, making the political borders bigger than they ever had been under the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, or the Second Reich, the German Empire. However, as we all know, the Allies eventually prevailed in the war, and during the Battle of Berlin in 1945, the city was overwhelmed by Soviet forces and the Austrian Painter killed himself. He was briefly succeeded by his chief of the German Navy High Command, Karl Donitz, for just 3 weeks in the spring of 1945, before Germany's unconditional surrender to the Allies. After World War II, Germany was occupied by the Allies for 4 years, which resulted in the dissolution of the German government entirely and a split occupation between the French, British, Americans, and Soviets. The pre-war German borders had significantly shrunk, with concessions given to Poland, Czechoslovakia, and every other country they occupied during World War II. The Soviet occupation zone was run very differently from the other three, with more severe punishments for people associated with the Austrian Painter's political party and a desire to establish a communist government in the region. In 1947, the British and American occupation zones merged together, and in 1949, the French one followed, creating the capitalist West Germany, and the Soviet occupation zone became the communist-controlled East Germany. You've probably heard of the famous Berlin Wall that split the capital city in two between East and West that fell in 1989, but we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves there. The East German government was just a Soviet Union puppet state, with elections that were not free nor fair. Their head position was called the Chairman of the Council of Ministers, who was essentially just a Soviet plant that didn't have all that much real power at all. There were 7 chairmen and 2 acting chairmen during the 40-year history of East Germany, none of whom were particularly historically relevant or memorable. The government of West Germany, however, is the more important to understand of the two because it's the one that remained in place once Germany reunified as a single country in 1990. The system is a parliamentary-based multi-party system with a careful balance of power, having a separate head of state known as the president and head of government known as the chancellor. The chancellor is the more politically powerful of the two, so we'll be referring to them as the modern leaders of Germany in this video. And there have now been 10 German chancellors and 1 acting chancellor. Konrad Adenauer was the first person to hold the role and bore the monumental task of being the first real leader of Germany since the Austrian Painter. Thankfully, he was considered one of the all-time political greats and played a pivotal role in rising Germany from the ashes and beginning to reshape their image following World War II, and he's frequently ranked as one of the greatest Germans of all time. Another important chancellor to take note of is Helmut Kohl, another broadly admired man who oversaw the collapse of communism in Europe and East Germany rejoining the West. And finally, that brings us to today, modern Germany. For basically my entire childhood, Angela Merkel was the German Chancellor, serving for over 16 years from 2005 to 2021, the second longest tenure in history. And earlier this year in 2025, the Germans held an election and Friedrich Merz became the newest German Chancellor. I think it's really interesting how on German election maps, you can still see East Germany voting as if it were a separate country. Anyways, that just about wraps up this video. I'd love to hear what other countries you think would be interesting to examine through their Regnal Chronology. In JJ's original video, again, please go check that out, he mentions Turkey, which I think would be a good one as well. If you liked what you saw today, please consider subscribing. I'm a small channel and genuinely every individual subscriber makes a huge difference in boosting the algorithm so I can try to bring educational, fact-based content to more people. Thank you all for watching. This is Bay State History signing off.